Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into a genuinely fascinating academic paper that actually dusted off a radical, century-old solution to our modern crisis of democratic debate. I mean, we live in an era where political gridlock just feels completely unavoidable, right? But what if the very framework we use to solve our problems is actually the thing causing the gridlock? Let's explore the brilliant work of Graham Wright and look at how a 100-year-old theory challenges pretty much everything we know about how we make decisions together. So consider this. What if the absolute best way to win an argument is to just stop trying to persuade the other person? It sounds completely counterintuitive, doesn't it? Our whole lives we're taught that to get things done, you have to build the best argument and basically convince the other side that you are right and they are wrong. But to understand why persuasion might actually be the root of the problem, we first have to take a look at the current gridlock and how we handle debate, or what academics formally call deliberation. Right now, academics are honestly kind of torn between two seriously flawed models of debate. First, we have what they call type 1 deliberation. This is your classic, highly rational debate model. Think of a very formal setting where every argument has to be strictly logical and fact-based. The problem? Well, this rigid requirement often unintentionally shuts out marginalized voices, or really just everyday citizens who don't have formal debate training. So to fix that, scholars proposed type 2. This model broadens the rules way out, welcoming emotional appeals and personal storytelling. But it comes with its own massive flaw. By relaxing the rules of logic, it basically opens the door wide for demagogues who can use emotion to mislead a group into making a genuinely terrible decision.
So here is the crucial point. Our very attempts to debate and persuade each other often lead right into either structural inequality on one hand or emotional groupthink on the other. And these are massive blind spots. Whether we enforce strict logic or just embrace emotional rhetoric, the end goal of modern deliberation is always the exact same. One side tries to persuade the other side to abandon their position. And as we're going to see, that core dynamic of persuasion is exactly what creates these structural flaws in our decision-making. What's truly wild about all of this is the year the problem was actually solved. Get this, 1918. Over a century ago, a visionary American thinker and management theorist named Mary Parker Follett anticipated these exact problems. Long before modern scholars were arguing over different debate models, Follett published a groundbreaking book called The New State. In it, she outlined a totally different approach to human interaction and democracy, one that didn't rely at all on our modern, flawed obsession with debate. Follett basically looked at how humans interact and argued that there are strictly three ways to resolve any conflict. The first is domination, where one side simply crushes the other, a really clear win-lose scenario. The second is compromise. Now, we often praise compromise in our society, but Follett viewed it as a lose-lose stalemate, where everyone gives up a little bit of what they truly want just to achieve peace. But then she introduced her hidden gem of a solution, the third way, integration. Integration is the co-creation of an entirely new solution that actually satisfies the core desires of everyone involved, without anyone having to give up anything.
I mean, think about your last family argument. Wouldn't a magical third option be nice? A perfect example of integration in action is this little anecdote Follett loved to share from a day she spent working in a Harvard library. She wanted the windows shut because she didn't want the cold north wind blowing directly on her. But another patron in the exact same room wanted the window open to get some fresh air. If they compromised, they might just leave the window open a crack, leaving her slightly chilly and him without enough air. A total lose-lose. Instead, they co-created a new solution. They opened a window in the adjacent room. The fresh air circulated into their room, fully satisfying his desire, but the direct wind didn't blow on her, fully satisfying hers. They integrated their desires. Neither person had to compromise. Now, you might be thinking, okay, that's great for an open window, but what about real complex problems? Well, the paper highlights a fantastic historical example from a 1920s farming cooperative. 2/3 of their farmers were violating a strict exclusivity contract. The committee was completely torn. Do they aggressively prosecute the violators and bankrupt themselves in legal fees? Or do they just ignore it and let the community tear itself apart? It seemed like a literally impossible choice. But here is how they actually applied Follett's theory. Rather than one side dominating the other, they dug way down to their underlying desires. By shifting the responsibility to local community committees, the cooperative integrated both needs. The headquarters maintained the strict policy that violators must be prosecuted, which protected the business. However, the initiation and investigation of that prosecution were handed over to local neighborhood oversight. This protected community cohesion. making sure that any extenuating circumstances were judged by peers, not some distant bureaucracy. They co-created a new system that satisfied everyone's core desires perfectly. And this brings us to the absolute most radical rule of Follett's whole theory. In standard debate, the goal is persuasion. You want someone to submit to your view. But integration strictly forbids persuasion. In Follett's eyes, even polite, logic-based persuasion is really just a form of domination. Think about it. If I convince you to adopt my pre-existing idea, we haven't created anything new. I've just dominated you with my superior debating skills. Integration demands that we abandon the desire to dominate and instead pool our differences to co-create a brand new solution.
But wait, you might be wondering at this point, if we aren't trying to persuade each other with our best facts and arguments, does this actually produce better decisions? Doesn't society need experts to persuade us of the right path? Well, this is where the paper takes a super fascinating turn into mathematics and epistemology, which is basically just a fancy way of saying how groups actually build knowledge and make choices.
Okay, let's dive into a really cool mathematical concept called error canceling. It's basically the invisible engine behind the famous wisdom of crowds and the diversity trumps ability theorem. In statistics, if you have a large and diverse enough group of independent problem solvers, their individual errors, biases, and blind spots will naturally cancel each other out when you aggregate their views. The collective judgment becomes vastly more accurate than even the smartest, most capable individual expert in the room. But, and this is a massive but, this only works if the group remains truly diverse and truly independent. To really visualize why error canceling needs independence, think of that classic parable of the blind men and the elephant. Several blind men touch different parts of an elephant to figure out what it is. One feels the trunk and assumes it's a snake. One feels the leg and assumes it's a tree. Another feels the side and thinks it's a wall. The lesson here is that every single person has a biased, limited perspective based entirely on where they happen to be standing in life. Their background, their profession, their social status. Now, imagine if these guys engaged in modern deliberation. What if the guy who felt the leg is just a really, really good debater? He uses stunning logic and emotional rhetoric to persuade all the others that it is undeniably a tree. Boom, he achieves consensus. But the moment he successfully persuades them, he destroys the diversity of the group. The group's independence collapses, error canceling fails, and they all confidently agree on a completely wrong answer. By persuading everyone, he actually destroyed the very diversity of thought they needed to find the actual truth. And this is exactly why the author of this paper argues that integration beats deliberation hands down. Integration prevents that articulate expert from dominating the room. It stops the groupthink that plagues so many modern institutions. Because integration bans persuasion, the blind men aren't allowed to convince each other of their pre-existing biases. Instead, they are forced to preserve their independence, pool their diverse ignorance, and co-create a new concept. An elephant, something which none of them could have possibly formulated alone from their limited vantage points. Now, this all sounds absolutely flawless in a small room. But how do you scale a 100-year-old idea up to an entire society? In political science, tackling this massive challenge is called the systemic turn. How do you take an intimate, face-to-face process and actually make it work for millions of citizens? Well, Follett herself actually envisioned a very structured grassroots hierarchy to solve this. She believed it had to start locally. Step one is neighborhood groups, where everyday citizens meet regularly. And not just when there's a crisis, but as a habit, to integrate their local differences. From those local integrations, they would send representatives up the chain to intermediate city groups, and the process of co-creation would repeat, all the way up to the state and national levels. It's a ground-up democratic system based entirely on synthesizing human difference. However, modern scholars point out a pretty glaring hurdle to Follett's neighborhood model today. Because integration relies entirely on harnessing diverse, opposing viewpoints to co-create solutions, modern partisan geographic sorting poses a very serious threat. We increasingly just live near like-minded neighbors. If a neighborhood group consists entirely of people who share the exact same political, economic, and social biases, well, there's no diversity of thought to integrate. It threatens to neutralize the very friction Follett said was absolutely necessary for progress. So to adapt her vision for the 21st century, modern scholars suggest something called distributed deliberation. Instead of one small group doing all the heavy lifting, society essentially divides the labor. Mass media brings opposing desires into the open. Public platforms break massive issues down into solvable parts. And finally, specialized delegates take those clarified desires and co-create the integrative solution. It's a team effort spread across society. As we wrap up this explainer, we're left with a truly powerful 100-year-old challenge to our modern gridlock. Mary Parker Follett saw a century ago that our obsession with debating, persuading, and winning was fundamentally tearing us apart and blinding us to real solutions. So I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. Are we brave enough to stop trying to win the argument? Can we shift our focus away from the comfort of dominating those who disagree with us and instead embrace the difficult, beautiful work of co-creating a society that actually integrates our differences?